We've been talking a lot about Wisconsin, and of course Illinois is also facing similar legislation in the guise of education reform underneath the concept called productivity counts. I wonder if the panel would take a crack at talks about productivity count, that Illinois is facing similar legislation, and I'm wondering if the panel would like to comment about the legislation that's pending in Illinois that almost got pushed through both the House and the Senate during the last week in December and the first week of January.
You know, so the question is about, can you in fact essentially put a dollar sign on everything that teachers do? And so do you essentially try and increase productivity among teachers and other sorts of public workers? And so those of you who are not faculty here, for instance, don't know that we now have to check how many hours we work each day on a, sort of a computer screen. We have to increasingly document our time, right? Because there's this widespread, of course, we believe, misperception among teachers as well as faculty that we're all just sort of sitting around, you know, eating candy bars, waiting for class to begin, right? And so we do 9 hours of work because we're in a classroom 9 hours, right? And so state legislators increasingly feeling the crunch, right, to increase efficiency put onto our backs, right? Increasing demands that we have to document our time in these sorts of ways. Predictably, we feel that we work plenty hard, but also that you can't put a dollar sign and a sort of an amount of time on everything that public sector workers, including teachers, do. I work a lot in the summer, although I don't get paid to work in the summer, right? Many teachers do the same sorts of things, right? And so there's this perception, essentially part of it, this attack on teachers in particular, is that teachers have easy lives. Whereas we know probably that's not the case, right? But that's part of an attack, again, on, I think, the public in public schools.
Productivity to add on your hours when you're checking papers?
Well, I don't minimize them.
Yes.
Right,
Productivity counts actually goes much further than that. It actually strips away seniority rights for teachers, primarily in the pre-K through 12. It strips away tenure rights, pre-K through 12. It ties the teacher evaluations in pre-K through 12 to evaluation or outcome student learning only directly. And perhaps one of the most egregious components of this is that it also eliminates the right to strike. And in the essence of doing so, it actually eliminates collective bargaining rights, because what it does is in the no strike and the no right to strike language, it basically allows school boards to impose its own its own contract with the teachers, and that would include anybody in higher ed as well, having no ability to counter that. If you striked, you would be fired against doing that. And this legislation was pushed very hard by several Democrats, actually, in the House, being funded by an organization called Stand for Children, which is actually a fairly large organization supported heavily by businesses outside of the state of Illinois that sent in about $1.2 million in state representatives and state senate races in the November election, and is now using that push in order to continue to push this attack on K through 12 and higher ed teachers. And it was only due to both the IEA and the IFT fighting back against that in early January with a counter proposal called accountability counts. And that battle is still going on right now in the Senate. Senator Lightfoot is the one who's actually dealing with the compromise, or trying to figure out a way to compromise this. But there is still very much held belief that there is going to be another attack by both Stand and by some of the other school board associations that are fighting to get rid of this right to strike, which would eliminate, in all essence, collective bargaining rights for teachers, eliminates tenure, seniority, and the like, which brings us way back to where we were in the early 1950s and 1960s.
Yeah.
In other words, it's going to roll back in many ways, the Illinois Labor Relations Act.
We would be back to making what people washing cars made, I guess,
Yeah.
like Albert Shanker. Actually, I have to say that I'm ashamed that I don't know about this. And what was the vote? Do you know how
It got stopped in committee at the present moment, and only in the Senate subcommittee because of Senator Lightfoot. And it took a huge rally on behalf of the IFT and the AFT in order to stop it. We sent in one day almost 10,000 people, either through phone calls or in the conversations,
Okay.
phone calls and or emails or appearances in Springfield and in legislative offices across the state in order to stop this legislation, at least temporarily. However, that being said, this is still going on, and the negotiations trying to solve this dilemma or this battle is anything but over with. And this is probably one of the biggest attacks currently in the state of Illinois that is really, really present. So we talk about this being only in Wisconsin or in Indiana or New York.
No, it's
New Jersey.
nationwide.
It's right here
It's
in
nationwide.
Illinois, and it's being funded heavily by an organization called Stand for Children. And what this organization did between the November election and the current, at the end of January, end of December, was send millions of dollars into this organization, because that's before the new caps came on terms of PAC payments and PAC contributions, setting themselves up for the next round of elections. And a lot of this had to do with the City of Chicago Teachers Union, with this false belief that the CTU is planning to go on strike next year, which they are not. There is an attack as well on all benefit levels across the board. This gets tied into pensions limitations on it. There's also going after the tuition waiver, which is actually in committee tomorrow afternoon by the Senate Minority Leader is bringing that forward. These type of issues are very much pertinent here, and a lot of it is, what's fascinating to me is that a lot of the money that's coming from STAND is actually coming from organizations that are for-profit educations. They want the charter schools, they want to see these other options because they want to load their pockets, and they're looking at the public schools as a way to get a lot of money. There's a lot of money in education that potentially has a way to filter back into their organizations. And this is starting to cause some serious problems, which are starting to question. We're already starting to see teachers right now leaving. We're having a hard time filling teachers primarily in years 2 or years 3, 5, 7, 9, where the assessments are attached directly to their evaluations, and that's part of what's happening here.
What you have to understand is the anti-union movement is also the anti-public education movement.
Yes.
And there is, they want to privatize schools, and this is part of that legislation, apparently.
And John, that legislation, I mean, did you mention that, I know small facets of that, and particularly the aspect of when you, the quality counts. I think, was that, if that was the proper term?
They use quality counts and they use productivity counts. They
Well-
switch between the two depending on whether or not you're talking to STAND or if you're talking to the Illinois Small Business Council or another organization.
Well, you know, since the 1930s with the whole progressive education movement, which had many different arms and facets, and one that we realized that looking at the business model of education is not a very productive one, where we can identify what the outcomes are and then create the machine to produce those outcomes. One of the scary things, or I shouldn't say scary, but one of the problematic things is that when we think that we can equate the outcome of what a student's able to do on one set of measures and connect that back to the quality of that teacher, we're removing all these variables from what is or what is not good education, or what is or what not maybe, what is or what may affect how someone performs on one singular set of measurements. And you're right, as we are losing those teachers who don't want to teach 5th grade, or don't want to teach 7th grade, don't want to teach 9th grade, because that's when those standardized measures or assessments are given. I mean, there's a danger there, but you're right, it is coming from that force of that desire to kind of de-skill the educators, and take out their ability to successfully identify what it means to be educated. I think that's what this whole anti-public school movement or anti-union movement is really aiming at. Again, it sounds like some type of a power movement here.
I think, too, there's an inherent danger, just my own unsubstantiated opinion, but to dovetail on what John said is, I think there's an inherent danger of this, too, is it's not just that approach. You know, what I'm seeing especially in the area of education is union members, teachers being asked to make concessions and saying, hey, this is tough times. We did it here at our own university, gave up a contractually obligated pay raise. And I think there's a lot of stuff going on like that too. Early buyouts, things like that are proposed as alternatives. So to me, where I think the danger comes in is if you're bargaining in good faith and both sides are saying there's a problem here, how do we address it? And there's this outward appearance of collaboration and let's give good faith on each side, then I think what I would refer to as like blindside legislation to come up with this, I think really kind of flies in the face of, a fair approach or fair negotiations at trying to resolve this to everyone's satisfaction. Like I said, if people are making concessions and then now you have legislation like this coming down the road, well, wait, what happened, to fundamental fairness here? What happened? I thought we were all working for the common good, and now I get blindsided with this? And then I think, the reason I say I think there's an inherent danger is now you get, that knee-jerk reaction to, if you're gonna do that, we're gonna do this, and I just think that's that slippery slope we don't wanna start going down, and I think, that's a problem with that.
Just out of curiosity, what role, if any, do any of you think capitalism plays when attacks like these are being made on unions and workers' rights?
Well, that's a small question.
It's a loaded question, too.
Well, I mean, when I go back to the Wisconsin idea, right, the idea that you can in fact regulate and tax corporations doesn't necessarily mean that you are advocating revolution, okay? But in a market economy, a capitalist economy, things work real simple, right? Corporations work on a for-profit basis. They're always looking, therefore, to reduce their costs, right? And in the public sector as well, right? The government is always also looking to reduce its costs. One major cost at this university, the most major cost, for instance, is salaries, right? Workers, labor. And so management, whether it's our university president or whether it's the owner of a private corporation, have the same intention, right? They want to reduce their costs, right? And so in a society like ours that's driven financially, right? Then it always comes down to that. And so then flip yourself. Are you a manager or are you a worker, right? Like, well, most of us are workers, right? Are you strong enough as an individual to stand up to the state of Illinois or to Walmart or to General Motors? The answer probably is no, right? And so what therefore levels the playing field a little for most of us is if we stand together, right? I mean, because ordinary people have numbers, right? That's essentially where our strength potentially lies. And so in our economy, our society, a capitalist society, if you are a management, right, if you're part of the elite, right, the economic elite, you have one set of interests, right? But if you're not part of that group, if you're part of actually the majority of the people, your interests lie in sort of working together in order to maximize the amount of wealth that the majority have, right? Like, and so, I mean, I think that of course capitalism plays a factor because this is a dollar-driven society, right? Like, and so since this is the one we live in, right? Then we figure out where we stand on that fundamental divide, right? Like,
Well, unions are a very capitalistic idea, if you think about it. I'll defer to correct me if I'm wrong to the labor historian, but when they took over the Ford plant in, 1937, the workers, they took over the means of production. Now, that's a very Marxist idea, but they didn't keep it that way. All they wanted to do was to be granted recognition as the union, the United Auto Workers, and be granted collective bargaining rights. And once they had that, and they said, we've got a chance to get a slice of this pie called profit, the means of production went back to the capitalists, to the Ford family.
If you could for a minute, because we've been discussing all these separate issues and problems and symptoms all night, can you put your collective hat together and maybe extrapolate what the real agenda is behind all of this? Based on a historical viewpoint.
I think it's privatization. And I think it's putting what has been public institutions into the hands of an elite, a wealthy elite. And I saw an interview the other day where the guy, he advocated privatizing the highways as an example, and taking it out of the public hands. Now, in my mind, I've read enough of the Federalist Papers to know that, when the Tea Party cites the Federalist Papers, I do know that there's talk about the public good, the common good in there. And I frankly don't think that privatization of public institutions is for the common good, the public good. But I think it's privatization, I really do.
I would use a stronger term than privatization. I'd call it hegemony. I think there's some hegemonic forces that are guiding, whether it's the Cook brothers, about that power and the desire to wield that power. I mean, I think privatization is the method behind that, but I think it's more out of control.